Well, it's becoming a growing problem in the United States. Younger people, young adults feeling lonely and struggling with their mental health as a result. Joining us to talk about this growing epidemic in the United States is Birmingham Maple Clinic Therapist Carrie Krawiec on today's program. Carrie, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate having you on. So, U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy had put out an advisory recently addressing how the epidemic of loneliness and isolation and a lack of connection is affecting the country. But in particular, this is really having an effect on younger adults. So let's talk about this epidemic of loneliness, so to speak. On the first hand, how this has really grown even after the COVID-19 pandemic. The throes of that has kind of gone into the rearview mirror by a year or so. But also why this is particularly affecting those in that 18 to 25 range really heavily.
So loneliness has always been something that's affected our older population as a person becomes more socially isolated or isolated in their ability to be able to reach out and connect to other people. They start to endure the effects of loneliness, which can be depression or anxiety, suppression of feelings, and then the physical effects, which eventually lead to maybe premature death, heart disease, other physical ailments. What we're seeing as a result, not necessarily as a result of the pandemic, but kind of coinciding with the end of the pandemic and the restoration of somewhat normalcy, is that young people, especially in that 18 to 25 range, are perhaps not going back to the same environments where meeting people would happen naturally, such as if you're entering the workforce at that age, you may be entering at in a virtual workforce, as opposed to where 25-year-olds a generation ago were working in person, perhaps engaging in workplace golf leagues or after work happy hours or other activities that were social in nature that are just not happening now. One of the things that wasn't mentioned by his study, but I think perhaps also plays a role, is the use of social media. On one side, social media serves this function that makes us believe we're connecting to people because we're seeing to them, we're interacting them, we're exchanging words with them online. But loneliness isn't just about not connecting with people. Loneliness is also about the perception that we are somehow different and unrelatable, and therefore other people wouldn't understand us or know what we're going through. And that emotional loneliness, I think, is really also created by this assumption that other people, on social media might be living these amazing, wonderful lives, and somehow they couldn't understand what we're going through. And then we further and further keep ourselves from sharing when we feel that way.
And you mentioned earlier, it was interesting because you mentioned how in the past this has particularly been an issue for those older populations, especially those that are maybe in positions where physically or just because of their overall health, they're not able to get out and about and socialize as often as they had used to, or because they are older in age, maybe their friends or their family that were previously around to socialize with them are unfortunately no longer with them. In this case, these are younger generations, younger people, 18 to 25 years old, is the particular problem area in discussion here, that have their whole lives ahead of them, but they're also kind of adjusting to their really emerging adulthood and into their mid-20s, where they're getting busier, their lives are developing, their adult lives are developing, and that can play a number of factors into this. But when we speak about the effects on these individuals, we know how loneliness has affected older populations near the end of their lives that have experienced this. But in terms of those lasting effects, how big of an impact could these feelings of loneliness have on these younger individuals later on in life, based on the physiological effects that they could be having now on top of the mental health effects?
Sure. So I think one of the things to mention, right, is that it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing. Loneliness is a symptom of depression, but perhaps also a contributor to depression. So it can cause further mental health issues. It can cause, further isolation, the avoidance of activities in the future for fear of shame or embarrassment or other anxieties, or because depression is set in, just making the motivation to do those things harder and harder. I think one of the things too about loneliness is it can affect emotional regulation. This is also a chicken or the egg thing, that the research really shows that people who have more difficulty emotionally regulating, that is sort of if they get in some sort of thought or, train of mind or, emotional state that they can get to a place where they can restore normalcy. People who experience high degrees of loneliness stay dysregulated for longer, or people that are somewhat emotionally dysregulated feel more lonely. It could be they're assigning more negative explanations for their experiences. And one remedy they call cognitive reappraisal, which is just a person's ability to kind of find a positive spin to it. So if you're by yourself, you're not necessarily lonely. If you can find the positive spin to it, that like, I'm choosing this is some time and space for myself, or I do know that there are people who love and care and understand about me, and that I'm allowing them to have the space that they need, which is good for them. A cognitive reappraisal of a situation, even your own experiences, something that bad, kind of turning your bad time story into somehow a learning opportunity or a good ending, can help change the experience of loneliness. It can also make us more likely then to share our stories. And that's really another remedy, is just instead of suppressing feelings and brooding and just thinking kind of those woe is me thoughts and nobody would understand me, is to like make small talk and even shared light, even to maybe total strangers at a park, library, community, like, hey, this is something that's been on my mind. You may not get the feedback you're looking for, but just the simple act of sharing it is really helpful. And from my frame of reference as a therapist, I hear so many people's stories all the time that I can say with certainty people are so much more alike in their experiences than different. But it really takes just talking and sharing and hearing that to know that it's true.
And it's unfortunate too, because so much of these issues are connected to other issues that may be like social anxiety issues that are even predating the loneliness that came from the COVID-19 pandemic, that can also affect people getting back out into these places that there is common communication, whether it's a park or at happy hour or back in the workplace, whatever the case may be. And over time, that kind of snowballs into what was previously that momentum of having that vibrant social life as you're growing up and as you're in school, to having the momentum going in the other direction where, well, I haven't been out in a long time and I'm not used to this. And maybe that pulls people back. So part of that is that reframing of the situation you're in that you talked about. But what are some other steps that people can take too if they're feeling that sort of social anxiety that comes along with, I haven't really been socializing lately, my friendships aren't the same as they used to be, I don't know if I'm even still welcome in this group or that group, to help push them through that initial point to get back out and socializing?
Right. I think it's starting out by just challenging some of those thoughts, right? That there's a good chance if you're feeling that way, someone else is either feeling that way too, or has felt that way before. And that it's okay to feel that way. I think also, we have some social norms and cultural norms and even gender norms about, what thoughts or feelings are allowed to be shared. But so we judge other people. Well, nobody else has ever felt this way. But the truth is they have felt this way. You just haven't seen it. Either they haven't shown it, or you just don't, you don't know about it. And that just kind of going with the assumption that your feelings are in fact normal and acceptable and okay, and instead of using them as an excuse to avoid, is to use them to try to kind of, again, maybe even rank or gradually kind of list what are your ideas of things that you'd like to do from maybe easiest to hardest in terms of how stressful they are for you or how much worry you have about them, and then kind of just check them off your list. So if it's start out, go to meeting of people you already know, or if that's even more for some people is more stressful, for some people you don't is more, and flip it based on your own thing. Make a list of just going to a park or a library or volunteering somewhere, starting somewhere that's maybe fairly neutral in terms of worry, and then working yourself up to what something might cause you more and more stress. And as you kind of take those steps, you're sort of scaffolding along the way of social interactions.
And those familiar social interactions can also be a really important way for people to get back out into the socializing, or even to just adjust to those feelings of loneliness they may be feeling, is reclaiming some of those old relationships that maybe have fizzled over the years or faded over the years, especially those young adults as they're growing their lives, your past friendships, they're growing their lives too. So what's your advice on that front for these people that still obviously value those relationships in their life to the point where they're feeling that quite viscerally as they're adjusting to some of these feelings of loneliness, to sort of rebuild or re-spark those other relationships that are still really important to them.
I think, right, if there's some concern or anxiety about sharing with someone else sort of where you've been or how you've been doing over the last, couple months or perhaps 3 years, start with them. As they start talking about themselves, you may find little points of intersection. This is something I can connect to. So, hey, I've been thinking about you. How are you? What's up with you? And as you walk through that path, even in just small talk, I think small talk's also gotten a bad rap. People act like, oh, that's just meaningless or whatever, but you really do have to start somewhere. It's almost like, inertia, an object at rest stays at rest, an object in motion stays in motion. But that going from stillness to movement is perhaps the hardest part. And just starting with those little small tiptoes of engaging with other people. And then as you build momentum, it'll just start to roll on its own.
And how can therapy also play into this too? Because for individuals, some are going to be able to make those adjustments quite quickly. They're going to find something that works, or they know something that works on their side to be able to fight through this. But in other cases, that trial and error can also really play a role into furthering those feelings of anxiety around this loneliness. So how can consulting with a mental health professional also really help you take those steps forward over time?
Sure, in multiple ways. I mean, the simple act of scheduling a therapy appointment or routine therapy appointments means that you're dedicating a weekly time to engaging with someone else. And when there's anxiety about it, certainly using a therapist as a starting point, as a first sort of support system, is just gaining the practice in revealing yourself to someone and showing up and being present, and then they're also participating in a way that's safe and non-judgmental and aware of your needs and history as you reveal it to them. Certainly therapists, like I said, have the other advantage of encountering many other people in their careers and practices to know and be able to say, I've actually heard something like this before. This reminds me of another story I've encountered, right? That you are not alone, and that other people have experienced things like you have, or have encountered things like you have, and that you are, like I said, more normal than you perhaps realize, more typical than you realize. When we're isolated, we feel more and more unique, more and more ashamed, and more alone. But the truth is, the more you share your story and the more someone's able to reflect back that really is normal, this really makes a lot of sense, there's a lot of validation in what you're saying, helps someone to feel not so different, and in and of itself not so alone.
We're joined by Carrie Krawiec, a therapist at the Birmingham Maple Clinic, on today's edition of the Megacast, as we are each and every week for our weekly mental health segment. You can find all of those on demand on civiccentertv.com/megacast to get in contact with Carrie and the other professionals at the Birmingham Maple Clinic, birminghammaple.com, or call them 248-646-6659, 248-646-6659 for more information. Carrie, with a few more minutes left, I want to circle back to talking about loneliness in older adults, which has typically been what we've seen on a more normal basis in the past. For those that may be experiencing loneliness at an older age, we mentioned some of the various reasons why: those lost connections with people in their lives because they've passed on, or because they have physical ailments and are no longer able to be as mobile and out and about as they can be. How do we help them through these feelings of loneliness? Because there's many more factors often that are at play than simply social anxiety, or I am not out and about with people of my age group as much as before.
Sure. I mean, I think, again, if you have the opportunity to talk to someone, whether it's a neighbor or, visiting a home dedicated to elder care, just using language and storytelling is beneficial for both the giver and the receiver. One risk factor for the aging population is, of course, dementia, and people who experience loneliness and isolation across their lifetime are more likely to experience dementia. But, communicating with people of different ages, stages, races, whatever, helps to continue to keep our neurons firing, growing, active. Our use of language active helps our brains as well. So, I mean, I think just talking and sharing stories is a natural. We've talked about before, sharing your experiences helps both the teller and the listener to have helpful stress hormones. And so, yeah, so I think just asking questions and listening to stories could be hugely beneficial. I think also, again, like this idea about, right, like suppression is that we believe like, oh, it's so rude to ask someone a question like that. You may find the aging population, perhaps it might be they haven't encountered it before, but they may also joyfully just be able to tell you something and want to share information and experience and wisdom that also may be helpful, positive, confidence boosting experience for them.
Well, Carrie, we appreciate you joining us to talk about a complicated issue, but also a growing issue across various age groups, including our younger populations at this time. Thank you, as always, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.